Welcome to this video. I'm glad you're here. You're here, and that's enough. Today, we're going to talk about winter. But not winter as you know it. Not the kind with cozy sweaters and central heating and hot chocolate made with oat milk. The sun rose later. The sun set earlier. The air changed. The soil hardened. The sky turned white, but not in a soft way. In a silent way, in a still way. In a way that said, nothing is coming. No help. No warmth. Just time. And cold. This is a different kind of winter. A much colder one, a much harder one, a much slower one. Winter in the medieval world was not something people looked forward to. It was not a holiday season. It was not festive. It was not beautiful. It was not peaceful. It was not quiet in the way people like quiet today. It was something they did until the cold woke them again, or until the fire went out, or until someone coughed and did not stop. But how they lived through a season that tried very hard to make sure they did not. It was a different kind of quiet. A cold quiet, and the dark. The dark was not just outside. It was inside the house, inside the body, inside the mind. A quiet filled with the sound of wind pushing through wooden walls. Wool layered over wool, wrapped in linen, stiff with smoke, heavy with damp, rarely washed, rarely removed, always itchy, never warm. The sound of coughing in the dark, the sound of hunger waking before the sun. Winter did not begin suddenly. It crept in slowly, day by day. For medieval peasants, winter was not a season. It was a condition. It was something they lived under like a roof made of frost. It covered everything. It touched everything. The food they ate, the clothes they wore, the beds they slept in, the bodies they buried. They had no heaters, no electricity, no central warmth. They had fire if they could find wood. They had smoke if the fire refused to burn clean. And they had each other, bodies packed together in homes with no insulation, no glass windows, no chimneys, just walls made of sticks and mud, and a roof made of straw that sometimes kept the snow out, but often did not. This was life in winter for a medieval peasant. Food was not cooked for taste. It was boiled to survive. Turnips, cabbage, onions, maybe a little barley, maybe dried peas. If they were lucky, very lucky, a small piece of salted meat, once a week, once a month. Sometimes not at all. Clothes were not changed with the season, they were the season. Sleep was not restful. It was not relaxing. The days were short, but they felt long. The nights were longer, and felt longer still. This is a story of how they survived, not how they thrived, not how they built empires or changed the world. This is not the story of kings or queens or knights or saints. This is the story of people with cold feet, empty stomachs, and no other choice but to last until spring. This is the story of winter and how medieval peasants survived it. It didn't start all at once. There was no moment when someone said winter is here, because in the medieval world, people didn't need calendars to tell them what was coming. They could feel it. The signs arrived slowly. A little less sunlight each morning, a little more frost on the wooden door. The ground softened by rain became stiff and dry, then hard, then frozen. The animals grew quiet. The birds stopped singing. The trees lost their leaves, and the color drained from the fields. Everything green turned gray. Everything living slowed down. The world itself seemed to take a deep breath and hold it. For the medieval peasant, winter didn't begin with snow. It began with stillness, a stillness that lasted. They watched the sun. They watched the sky. They listened to the wind. They knew how long they had before things became difficult. Not because someone told them, but because they had lived it before, and they would live it again if they were lucky. The coming of winter meant one thing above all: prepare. Because once it arrived, there would be no time left. They stored what they could. They dried beans. They salted meat. They hung onions and garlic in bunches. They ground what grain they had into flour. They dug root vegetables from the earth and buried them again in cellars. Cold, dark, damp spaces, full of food they hoped would still be food in 3 months. They patched the roof. If they had a roof, they stuffed straw between the cracks in the walls. They brought firewood inside, or peat, or dry dung, or whatever would burn. Even if it burned badly, even if it smoked, even if it made their eyes sting, because smoke was better than cold. And cold was worse than almost anything. They repaired shoes. If they had shoes, they layered wool if they had wool. They wrapped children in whatever was dry, even if it wasn't clean. Clean could wait. Warm could not eat. Men checked on animals. The women checked on the children checked on nothing, because they were cold and hungry and told not to get in the way. And every year, as winter approached, people remembered who hadn't survived the last one. A grandmother, a cousin, a neighbor, someone who went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. Not from plague, not from war, just from cold. They didn't talk about it much. They didn't cry about it. There was no time for that. There was only time to survive the next one. So they did what they always did. They waited. They listened. They watched the trees. They watched the sky. They watched the breath leaving their mouths in the morning. And they waited for the snow, because once the snow came, there was no going back. And when the first snow finally fell, it did not fall like a surprise. It felt like a confirmation that what they feared was now here, that what they had prepared for was now real, that the long, dark, cold part of the year had finally begun. The weather in the Middle Ages was not decoration. It was not conversation. It was not something people checked or ignored or forgot. It was the first thing they noticed in the morning and the last thing they felt at night. The weather decided everything. It decided the work. It decided the food. It decided the sickness, the hunger, the survival. The weather was not background. The weather was life. It shaped where animals grazed and when they could be slaughtered. It shaped the construction of homes, the layering of clothes, the way people gathered wood, the way they built fires, the way they stored grain, the way they stored breath in cold rooms, in cold seasons. They watched how the clouds moved, and what direction the smoke leaned when it left the roof, if it left at all. They watched the color of the morning and the shape of frost on stone. They did not study the weather. They lived inside it, and it lived inside them. Meant roofs that sagged and collapsed on the animals and the people and the food. If the wood was wet, the fire would die, and if the fire died, the warmth would go. That the spring was cold and the summer was gray and the harvest came later or not at all. That the snow fell before the leaves did, and the ground froze before the animals could be moved. Those were the years when stories of famine returned. Stories of children fed thin soup made from bark and roots. The world simply existed, and you were lucky to live inside it. It was a release, a moment of pause, before it all began again. Stories of neighbors dying quietly in beds too cold to wake up in. And once warmth was gone, it was hard to bring it back, because winter came every year, and it never asked permission, and it never cared whether you were ready, and even if you were ready, that didn't mean you would survive. And the weather was changing, slowly, not all at once, and rot the last fruit and spoil the grain before it dried. And when that happened, there was no replacement, because there were no trucks, no storage silos, no shipments from other towns. That pulled the straw from the roof and the warmth from the body. Wind that howled through thin fabric and thin walls, and made it hard to sleep, hard to breathe, hard to be still. If one field failed, the people around it failed too, not with fire or storms or signs in the sky, but with cold, with wet, with a long gray stretch of time that became normal and stayed that way. Historians now call it the Little Ice Age. It was a long, slow presence that shaped the land, shaped the people, and shaped the way they thought about the world, about God, about suffering, about time. A period of centuries where the world turned colder than before. Colder enough to matter, colder enough to shorten growing seasons, colder enough to turn rain into snow and mud into ice, colder enough to stretch winter just a little longer than anyone wanted. The people did not call it that. They did not give it a name. They only called it a bad year, or a hard year, or a lean year. But there were more lean years than fat ones, and each one left memories in the soil, in the bodies, in the stories told by those who remembered, and those who survived. The climate shaped everything. It shaped what could be planted when it could be planted, how long it could grow, and whether it would live to be hot. When winter arrived, it came harder than before. The rivers froze thicker, the snow stayed longer, the mud returned later, and the sun disappeared more each year. It felt that way. Maybe it was only memory, or maybe it was true, but for the peasants who lived with no calendar, and no thermometer, and no written record, memory was enough. Memory and the feeling in their bones. They watched the skies, the wind, the birds. One early frost could ruin everything. Just one. Just a night or two at the wrong time in autumn could kill the last vegetables. Rain could be worse. Too much rain meant flooding, meant rot, meant mold in the cellars, meant wet clothes that never dried. Wind came often. Wind that rattled the walls, that shook the shutters. There were years when the people said the seasons had forgotten their order, and still they waited. Still they watched. Still they endured, because they had to. The medieval climate was not one thing, it was many things. It was unpredictable, unkind, unmoved. It was sky and air and water and silence, because when the wind blew, and the roof cracked, and the fire went out, and the food ran low, and the stars disappeared behind a sky of frozen cloud, you began to understand that the world was not built for you. And when spring finally came, when the ice melted, and the air softened, and the rivers moved again, it was not a celebration, because the weather was always waiting. The medieval peasant home was not warm, it was not cozy, it was not safe from the cold. It was a place to be less cold, not to be warm. It was shelter, and shelter was not the same as comfort. It was built from whatever materials were near. If there were trees, mud, if there was water and soil, stone if the land was hard, straw if there were fields. People did not choose what to build with. They used what was around, what they could carry, what they could shape, what they could stack. Glass was rare, expensive, foreign. Windows were holes, covered with cloth, covered with wooden shutters, covered with whatever they had. Light was not worth the cold it let in. So they chose dark, because dark was warmer. The homes were small, usually just one room, sometimes two, but not often. Bodies gathered near the fire, sat near the fire, slept near the fire. They wore all the clothes they had, blankets, if they owned any, cloaks, if they had them, old wool, old linen, stiff from use, stiff from damp, stiff from smoke. More rooms meant more walls. More walls meant more cold to keep out, and they could not keep it out, not really. There was no insulation, not because it was clean, but because it was warm. Body heat was heat, even when it smelled, even when it moved, not in the way we know them. Just spaces, corners, piles of straw, a raised board, if you were lucky, if you were important, or sick, or old. Everyone else found a place to curl and sleep if they could, even when it made noise. A warm pig was better than a cold night. Even inside it crept through the walls, through the roof, through the floor. It waited near the door. It waited near the windows. It waited inside the stone. It lived in the air. There was no escaping it, only avoiding it, only delaying it. No seal, just layers of mud and sticks and straw and prayers. The cold came through anyway, through the cracks, through the gaps, through the floor, through the roof, through the silence. Not large, not powerful, but central and essential. If there was firewood, it burned. They only hoped to last, to outlast the night, to outlast the frost, to outlast the winter. If there was peat, it smoked. If there was dung, it's a season, a fact. And the home, their only home, was not a defense. It was just something that stood, something that stayed, something slightly less cold than the world outside, but it always did something. Heat, light, smoke, life, everything centered around it, and when it went out, people noticed, because the cold noticed first. The floor was not wood. It was not stone. It was not finished. It was the ground, packed earth, stomped down by generations of feet, covered in straw, covered in hay, and so the smoke, when it had nowhere else to go, would curl and hover and sit in the space just above the heads, blackening the beams, blackening the thatch, filling lungs, filling eyes. There was no chimney, just a hole, maybe a gap in the roof. At night it was banked under ash, hidden, but still glowing, waiting to be woken. If the fire went out, it was not a small inconvenience, it was danger. It meant numb hands, frozen feet, ice forming in the water bucket, breath in the air, silence in the corners, or the door left open for a while, until the wind came, or the snow, then it stayed closed and the smoke stayed in, covered in filth that absorbed water, it absorbed ash, it absorbed waste, it absorbed life, and over time it became something like a floor. The roof was low, so the heat, if there was any, could stay close. Most homes had a central hearth, a fire pit. During the day, the fire was kept alive, tended, protected, fed like a living thing, and when there were windows, they were not made of glass. Inside the home, people lived close, families, children, elders, sometimes neighbors, sometimes strangers. They slept on straw, on wood, on cold ground, with animals, if they had them, a goat, a pig, chickens, a dog. There were no bedrooms, no beds. The cold was always there, and so the people endured it because they had no other choice. They did not expect warmth, they did not hope for comfort, and if they did, they would do it again next year, because the cold was not an enemy, it was a condition. And in the Middle Ages, slightly less cold was the closest anyone came to warmth. Medieval peasants did not dress for style. They did not dress for expression. They did not dress for the seasons. They dressed because they had to, and they wore what they had, which was often not enough, and never quite right. They wore wool, because that was what could be made. Wool was warm when dry. Sometimes wool was heavy when wet. Always, wool could be spun, could be woven, could be shaped into tunics, cloaks, hoods, and hose. It was scratchy, it was rough, but it was what they had, and so they wore it. They did not have wardrobes. They did not have closets. They did not have a collection of outfits. They had a tunic, maybe a belt, some underclothes, perhaps a pair of hose, if they were lucky, a cloak, if they were very lucky, and shoes if they could afford them. If you had two tunics, you wore them both in winter. Wind turned a cold day into something much worse. So cloaks were pulled tighter, hoods drawn over heads, scarves wrapped over mouths, and still the wind found a way in. Not warmth. Warmth was rare. Warmth was for those sitting close to the fire, wrapped in furs, with dry socks and dry hands. They had fewer clothes, smaller clothes, often hand-me-downs, torn and too big or too small. They ran, not for fun, but to stay warm. They were told to move, told not to sit still, told not to stay wet. But they did, because they were children, because they didn't understand how cold killed, until it did. No lining, no structure. Feet were often wrapped in cloth, sometimes straw. The goal was not comfort. The goal was distance. If your socks were dry, you kept them close. If your cloak was dry, you didn't leave the house, because the moment you stepped out it would be soaked, and once wet, it might never dry again. Through sleeves, through collars, through seams, through soaked wool, through rags wrapped around fingers and feet, any distance between skin and frost, even if it was wet, even if it was filthy, was something you felt near a fire, or in bed, pressed against another body, or, rarely, in the middle of the day, when the sun found a way through the clouds. But those moments were few and fleeting. Everyday clothes and best clothes were sometimes identical. The only difference was whether they were torn, whether they were patched, whether they still fit, and that was all anyone expected. That was all anyone hoped for. Slightly less cold, but it was not protection, not real protection, not total protection. It was an attempt, a barrier, a slow resistance, but never a cure. Warmth was not for peasants working in the fields, or for those with means. Fingers froze, turned red, then white, then numb, but the work went on. Chopping wood, tending animals, carrying stones, stirring pots. There was no changing into something dry or warm or soft. There were no beds, just piles of straw. If a family had fur, it was guarded, the oldest or the most useful. Maybe a blanket, maybe two, if there were enough to go around. Washing clothes meant removing them, and waiting, and drying, and exposure. So most people simply didn't. They wore dirt, they wore soot, they wore the winter itself. The hands kept moving, because if they stopped, the cold crept in faster. Not for children sleeping on straw, not for women hauling buckets of icy water. If you had a woolen cloak, you wore it until it reeked, until it could no longer hold shape, until it was more whole than cloth. But you still wore it, because anything was better than nothing. Most peasants wore the same clothing every day, washed rarely, mended often. Holes were patched with scraps, tears were sewn with thick thread or string, edges frayed, seams weakened, but as long as it could be worn, it was worn. And once it could no longer be worn, it became rags, or bandages, or stuffing. Layers were a luxury, but also a necessity. In cold months, people dressed with one goalless cold. There was no concept of layering as we know it today. There was no base layer, no thermal layer, no outer shell. There were only clothes, stacked when possible. Thin linen, if it existed, worn close to the skin, wool above that, cloaks on top, as many as the body could carry. And still work. Cloaks were common. Some had hoods, some were fastened with simple brooches, others tied with string. They hung heavy on the shoulders, absorbed rain, absorbed snow, absorbed the scent of smoke and sweat and wet earth. They did not shed water well, but they offered coverage, a shield, not from cold, but from direct wind. The wind mattered. Cold air was one thing, wind was another. Wind cut through cloth, wind pulled heat away. Feet were almost never dry. Shoes, when worn, were basic, leather if available, thin soles, worn fast. Hands were bare. Mostly, gloves existed, but they were rare, reserved for work. Children had it worst at night. Clothes were not taken off, they were kept on. People slept in what they wore. The same tunics, the same cloaks. Furs existed, but not for most people. Furs were expensive, difficult to acquire, and valuable. Cleanliness was not prioritized. Not in winter. A clean cloak that was wet was worse than a dirty one that was dry. If you had something dry, you held on to it. Work clothes and sleep clothes were often the same. In cold weather, clothing was a tool, a defense, a symbol of preparation. Because the cold always found a way. Clothing delayed the cold, it didn't defeat it. Warmth, real warmth. Most of the time, the clothing just made you slightly less cold than you would have been without it. Because in the Middle Ages, warmth was not a guarantee, it was a rumor, a memory, a myth. And the clothes remembered it too. In the Middle Ages, fire was not a convenience. Fire was not a decoration. Fire was not something you used when it got a little cold. Fire was survival. Without fire, there was no heat. Without fire, there was no cooking. Without fire, there was no light. Without fire, there was no life. Every peasant home needed fire, and fire needed fuel. But fuel was not easy to find. Fuel had to be gathered. Fuel had to be chopped. Fuel had to be dried. And fuel had to be protected. Forests were often owned by lords, by monasteries, by kings. You could not take what you needed, not without permission. And permission was rare. In ditches along fence lines, they dragged branches for miles, tied them in bundles, carried them on their backs, one load at a time, every day, again and again, protected from drafts. Coaxed in the morning, fed carefully, blown to life. It was not easy. Sometimes it failed. Sometimes it needed help. From one fire to another, from neighbor to neighbor, from the village to the field. If a house lost its fire, someone would go find another. Carry a coal in a pot, wrapped in moss, wrapped in cloth, keep it breathing, keep it alive. Hot embers, dry tinder, kindling, all had to be prepared, all had to be stored, because once it was gone, it was not replaced. Easily, wet wood would not burn, or it would burn with thick smoke, smoke that choked Every piece of wood had potential. Every piece of wood was a decision. Burn it now or use it later. If it burned, it was gone forever. Every day it threatened to die. Every wind threatened it. Every wet log weakened it. Every night made it smaller. And every morning, someone had to wake before the rest. Had to crawl to the hearth. Had to check the coals. Had to blow. Had to wait. Had to hope. And every flame was a small resistance against a long, hard, bitter season that never asked for permission and never waited for anyone to be ready. But firewood burned fast. Meals had to be simple. One pot, one flame, one result. Fire was not wasted. Not on luxuries. Not on experiments. Where clothes were dried. Where people sat. Where stories were told. Where warmth gathered. And where people hoped it would stay. Even in the snow. Even in the cold. Even in the rain. Children gathered twigs. Women carried bundles. Men chopped logs. Every hand helped. Smoke that filled the house. Smoke that stung the eyes and coated the walls. So wood was stored carefully. Inside, if possible. Some homes had grates. Most did not. The fire was low. On the floor, in a pit. With stones around it, sometimes raised. Sometimes not. Smoke had nowhere to go. It rose. It stayed. It filled the room. And everyone lived in it. Closer when cold. Pulling away when the smoke grew thick. Gave light. Gave ash. Gave life. Turning to warm each side. Drying sleeves. Drying socks. Drying hair. Drying hands. Under eaves and corners. In lofts. Wherever it could stay dry. Wood was the most common source of fuel. But not everyone had access to forests. Not everyone had the right to cut down trees. Left to dry in the sun. Heavy at first. Lighter when dry. Peat burned slow. Burned long. But smelled strange. It was not clean. It was not pleasant. But it burned. And that was what mattered. When winter came, anything that burned was precious. Still, it was better than nothing. It was warmth. It was fire. So people gathered fallen branches, twigs, dead wood, rotten wood. They searched along roads. Wood had to be dry. If wood was scarce, they burned peat. Peat was cut from bogs, dug out in blocks. In some places, people burned dung. Dried and packed, it was not ideal. The fire itself was sacred, not in ceremony, but in function. The hearth was the center of the home. It was where food was made. Fire was never left to die. It was banked at night, covered with ash. Starting a fire from nothing was difficult. There were no matches, no lighters. Fire had to be struck, flint and steel. Or carried firewood was not just for the hearth, it was for tools, for fences, for handles, for carts. Too much wood was never a problem. Too little wood always was. The work of collecting fuel never stopped. It continued through the fall, through the winter. The fire was shared. People sat around it, not around in comfort, but in necessity. Food was cooked over fire, porridge, stew, bread, boiled roots. Everything needed heat. Some homes had ovens, most did not. Ash was gathered too, used in soap, used in lye, used in the garden. Nothing was wasted. Fire gave heat, but the struggle never ended. Fire was hard to start, hard to feed, hard to keep. And if the fire came back, the day began. And if it didn't, the day began colder. In the Middle Ages, fire was not just fire. It was time, it was food, it was breath, it was memory. It was ritual. And so they kept gathering, kept chopping, kept burning, kept watching. Because fire did not keep itself. And cold did not care. In the Middle Ages, food was not constant. It did not flow from shops. It did not wait in cupboards. It did not rest in refrigerators or freezers or cans or sealed plastic. Food came from the ground, from the field, from the garden, from the forest, from the animal, from the harvest. And the harvest came once a year. One harvest, one moment, one chance to collect what the year had grown, what the weather had allowed, what the soil had produced. And that one harvest had to last. It had to feed the family through the fall, through the winter, through the spring, until the next harvest came. In barrels, in bins, in lofts, in root cellars, in granaries, if the village had one. But no place was perfect. A single leak could ruin a barrel. A single rat could spoil a sack. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. Too much rain, too little rain. Wind disease, bad luck. It was salted, smoked, dried. But that took time. That took salt. That took smoke. Smoke took firewood. Pigs were killed, their meat salted, their fat rendered. But not every family had a pig, not every family had salt. Not every family had the means, and some stopped entirely. Butter could be stored, but it spoiled too, especially in warmer winters. And the more you preserved, the less you could eat today. Dried and kept, if they were dry enough, if they were stored carefully, if the jars did not crack, if the sacks did not leak. No expiration dates. Food spoiled. Food rotted. Food attracted rats, mice, insects, mold, moisture. Dried slowly. Beans were hung in bundles. Herbs were tied in bunches. Apples were stored carefully, turned often. discarded when they began to rot. Cows and goats gave less in winter, sometimes none at all. The time between the last of the old and the first of the new. A dangerous time, a quiet time. A time when many died, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, fading. And when the harvest failed, there was no backup. There was no safety net, until only the hard remained. The dried, the salted, the old, the bitter, ate slowly, ate what they had stored, then what they had hidden, then what they had saved, then what they never meant to eat. Ground into flour, made into bread, boiled into porridge, the old stayed in bed. The strong worked harder. Until they weren't strong anymore, they were stored in earth, in cool places, sometimes buried, sometimes packed in straw. Harder, and those who survived last winter might not survive this one. And food was not expected, because it was never guaranteed. They lasted through the early winter, sometimes into spring, but not always. Prayed for time, prayed for dryness, prayed for enough. But grain had to be dried, stored off the ground, protected from damp, from mold, from the cold that cracked it, from the warmth that sprouted it, from mice, from rats, from people. It was the season of hunger. The food was gone. The next harvest had not come. The gardens were bare. The fields were brown. The animals were thin. There was only less food and more hunger. But it rarely lasted. The harvest could fail. What was gathered had to be stored, but storage was not easy. There were no sealed containers, no preservatives, no vacuum seals. Grain was precious. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. It was the base of the peasant diet. It was kept in sacks. Vegetables were harder. Root vegetables lasted longest. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions, cabbage was hung upside down. Meat was rare, and meat did not last. Fresh meat spoiled quickly. When the grass was gone, when feed was short, milk was made into cheese. When it could be, soft cheeses went bad quickly. Hard cheeses lasted longer, but milk was not always available. Eggs were fewer. Chickens laid less and cold. And then there were stores of beans, peas, lentils, but no food lasted forever. As winter passed, food grew scarce. First the soft things disappeared, then the fresh, then the sweet, then the easy, and eventually, sometimes, nothing. Spring was not the season of abundance. This was the hunger gap. People ate less. Bark was boiled. Roots were dug. Nettles were gathered. Grasses, leaves, anything that might offer something. The weak grew weaker. The sick grew sicker. Children cried, then stopped crying. Spoiled food was still food. Mold was scraped off. Bread was soaked. Porridge was stretched, watered down, shed, counted, watched. And every day they waited for green, for signs of life, for the thaw, for the buds or the shoots, because until then, hunger stayed. And if the next harvest came, if it grew, if it survived, if it could be gathered, then the cycle could begin again. But if it failed, hunger would return sooner. In the Middle Ages, food was not wasted, because there was never enough. You stored what you could, protected what you had, because between harvests, all you had was what you saved, and what you saved might not be enough. In the Middle Ages, water did not flow from taps. It did not come from pipes. It did not wait in bottles, filtered and clear, lined up on shelves. Water came from rivers, from streams, from wells, from rain, from snow, and getting it was not easy, especially in winter. Streams froze, wells froze, buckets froze. The surface turned solid, ice thickened overnight. Sometimes it cracked, sometimes it didn't, and so people broke it, with sticks, with stones, with axes, every day, again and again. Peasants could not take water for granted. They had to go to it, walk to it, carry it, and when it melted it became murky. It tasted of smoke, it tasted of earth, it tasted of what the roof had held. In buckets, in barrels, in jars, every drop was earned, slowly, over fire, in pots, in pans. It took time, it took heat, and firewood was precious. Melting snow meant choosing between water and warmth, sometimes both, sometimes neither, because water was dangerous, because water made people sick, because boiling was slow, and fire was limited. An ale, at least, had been boiled once, in tubs in anything with a bottom. But winter rain was rare. It did not make them warm, but it did not kill them, not usually. Melt snow, then use the rest to clean the floor. Nothing was thrown away. Even the grayest water had a purpose, and when water was gone, it came quickly, and cold, and not always welcome. And if it froze, the barrel split, the tub cracked, the ice expanded, and what had been saved was lost. Sometimes fingers bled, and still the work was done, because there was no other option, because without water, nothing could live. In warm months, it was hard. In cold months, it was harder. The air too sharp, to undress was dangerous. To be wet was worse. And so people stayed dirty, not because they wanted it, but because it was safer Their water froze overnight, and so every morning it had to be broken, to dip carefully, to avoid slipping, to avoid dropping, to wait their turn, because water meant order, it meant discipline, it meant patience, not just of water, but of time, of effort, of warmth. New water hold, again and again, in buckets, in freezing air, with things floating, with things settled at the bottom. They melted it, they chipped at it, they cursed it, and they waited, and they drank it anyway. But in the cold, even the deep water could freeze. Buckets stuck, ropes froze stiff, hands froze stiff. Pulling water became work, heavy work, risky work, icy ladders, slick stones, numb fingers. And still the water had to come. A frozen stream was not a source of water. It was a barrier, a block, a sign that the season had changed. It grew, it thickened, it covered streams for months. It turned wells to stone. It made the world hard and silent, and that thirst would be different now. Snow was everywhere, but snow was not water. Not at first. It had to be melted. For drinking, for cooking, for cleaning, for animals, for children, for everything. And snow was not clean. Not truly. It carried ash. It carried dust. It carried what the wind had left behind. Rainwater was collected when it could be. In barrels, wells were dug deep, lined with stone, because water was needed. It boiled slowly, on small fires, in small pots. Clean water was rare. Warm water was rarer. Most drank what they had, cold, stale. Sometimes they drank ale, weak ale, small beer, brewed not to celebrate, but to survive. The ale was not strong. It did not make them drunk. In deep winter, water was rationed. Use twice or 3 times. Wash hands, then wash clothes. Boil once, then cook. Bathing was rare. In winter, almost impossible. The fire was too small, the water too cold. Cleanliness waited for spring. Thirst did not. Thirst was daily. Thirst was quiet. Thirst was slow. The animals needed water too. Chickens, goats, cows. They could not drink ice. They could not eat snow. Sometimes water spilled, sometimes buckets cracked. Children learned early to carry small jars. A spilled bucket was a loss. In some winters ice never thawed, and when ice ruled, people endured it. Waited for rain, for sun, for warmth. Waited for the sound of dripping, for the stream to move again, for water to return. Because in winter, water was not a right, it was not automatic. It was not easy. Water was work, and thirst was constant. In the Middle Ages, night was not a time of rest. It was a time of darkness. And darkness was not just the absence of light. It was a presence, it was a weight, it was a season in itself. Winter brought the longest nights, and long nights meant long hours without sun. The sun rose late, the sun set early, and in between, the light was never strong. Pale, weak, dim through clouds, dim through smoke, dim through frost on the windowsill. Windows existed at all. When the sun was gone, light did not remain, because light had to be made. And making light took effort, took time, took material, took knowledge, and peasants had little of any of those. There was the hearth. The fire, it gave warmth and it gave light. A candle was a decision, a cost, a precious thing. Guarded, burned only when necessary. But the light was low, flickering, shifting. It did not fill the room. It did not reach the corners. It danced on walls. It cast shadows, long shadows, moving shadows. The fire was the center, but it was not enough. Not to sew, not to read, not to mend, not to see clearly. Mending could wait. Reading was rare. Most peasants could not read, so nothing was missed. Time to speak, time to rest. Not because they wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. With the wood settling, with animals stirring, with ice cracking. Candles were rare. They were not household items. They were not daily objects. They were not casually burned. Candles could be made from beeswax, but beeswax was expensive, kept for churches, for monasteries, for the rich, with a candle inside. But they were rare and precious and fragile, and the light inside was weak. Peasants used tallow, animal fat, rendered down, molded, dipped, stiffened, smoky, soft, foul-smelling tallow. Candles sputtered, dripped, not because of stories, but because of reality. The dark was when people fell, when thieves moved, when wolves crept close. It concealed, pressed against windows, pressed into the seams of the house. Wicks failed, oil spilled, but they gave light enough to use your hands, enough to find your shoes. Not to keep others out, but to keep the dark out. Tallow was not always available. It meant slaughter. It meant fat. It meant fire to render it. So candles were stored. Sometimes people used rushlets, dried reeds dipped in fat, burned fast, burned dirty, but they were cheap. Easier to make, easier to lose. Oil lamps were known, but oil was precious. Olive oil was foreign. Animal oil was hard to come by. Lamps broke, not out of peace but out of necessity. There was nothing else to do, so people lived with the dark. They accepted it. They adapted to it. They sat closer together. They finished work early. Sometimes the stars could be seen. Sometimes they couldn't. They told stories, slowly. In the glow of the hearth, eyes adjusted, tasks were slowed, expectations lowered. Night became time to be still. Darkness was not silent. It creaked. It groaned. It moved with the wind. It was a way of life. Shadows tricked the eye. Shapes shifted. The imagination worked because the dark did not reveal. At those moments, to find the midwife's hands, to count the breaths, to close the eyes. Children were taught to fear the dark. Lanterns existed, made of horn or thin leather. To move through the dark was to risk injury. Fire could fall, oil could spill, feet could stumble, so people stayed in. Doors were barred. It pressed against walls. Sometimes the moon gave light, a cold light, a distant light. Clouds covered the sky. Snow reflected nothing. Wind howled through branches. And inside, people waited. They slept early. Candles were saved for birth, for sickness, for death, because the body demanded light, but not for every night, not for every hour, not for comfort. Darkness ruled not with force, but with stillness, with weight, with length, and every year it returned, longer, colder, quieter, until the light came back, until the days grew longer, until the sun stayed just a little more. Because in winter, light was not cheap, and the absence of light was not just night. In the Middle Ages, getting sick was common, getting better was rare, and getting sick in winter was worse than almost anything else, because winter made everything harder breathing. Moving, eating, resting, healing. Winter did not cause illness, but it gave it room to grow, to linger, to deepen. And when the body weakened, winter was waiting. A cough that might pass in summer stayed in the lungs in winter, turned wet, turned deep, turned dangerous. A cut that might heal in a week festered in the cold, never truly clean, never truly dry, never truly warm, weakened to strong, broke down the already weak. The sick could not keep food down, could not find appetite, could not digest what they were given, and the sick could not fetch it. Someone else had to carry it, heat it, hold it, feed it to them carefully, slowly, one spoon at a time. Thin soups, weak porridge, cold bread, whatever the house had, nothing more, honey if there was any left, salt if it hadn't been used for meat. But even these were few. Not every village had an herbalist. Not every home had a garden. Not every illness had a name. Every illness lasted longer in the winter. Every ache was sharper. Every fever stronger. Every weakness deeper. Cold air made breathing harder. Damp rooms made fevers worse. Slowly, weakly. Others did not. They coughed until they bled. They shivered until they stopped shivering. They whispered until they stopped speaking. Then they lay still. And when they stopped rising in the morning, people did not ask why. They simply covered them. In barns. In corners. Cold kept them until the thaw. Until the ground could be broken. Until the priest could come. Smoke from the hearth choked the sick and offered no comfort. No processions. Just prayer and cold air and silence. It was a cough at night, a missed meal, a pale face, a heavier blanket, a longer nap, a colder hand. They faded. Sometimes they survived. Sometimes they didn't. A child lost in winter was common. Not because it was accepted, but because it was expected. There were no doctors in the village. Maybe a midwife. Maybe an herbalist. Hands froze to metal. Fingers cracked open. Bones broke. And winter gave no mercy. There was no time to be injured. No room to be still. You limped. You groaned. You worked anyway. And if the wound swelled, if it turned black, if it began to smell, then you waited for it to drain. Or for the fever. Or for death. And there were no casts. No clean bandages. No antiseptic. The wound was wrapped. Sometimes it killed slowly. Sometimes it didn't kill, but it left something behind, a weakness, a crooked finger, a stiff knee, a limp, a hand that wouldn't grip, a back that wouldn't bend. These were remembered, carried, lived with. They became part of the body, with cloth, with rags, with strips of old clothes. It was cleaned with water. If there was water, pressed with hands, tied with string. And then you moved on. Maybe an old woman who knew what to boil and where to rub it, straw, if lucky, often damp. Blankets were thin, the room was cold, the air did not move, or move too much. There were no windows to open, no glass to close, just shutters, cracks, smoke leaking in, wind slipping through. There was no isolation. The sick lay beside the healthy, a cough spread. The fever passed. One child fell ill, then another, then another. The house was small. Illness had nowhere else to go. But no one had formal knowledge, no one had tools, no one had training. Illness was treated with prayer, with roots, with faith, with rest, when rest was possible, but rest was rarely possible in winter. Work did not stop. Cold did not wait. Fields still needed clearing. Animals still needed feeding. Fires still needed tending. The sick still had to move, still had to rise, still had to contribute. The beds were hard, Food was thin in winter. Thin food made thin bodies. Water was colder, harder to get, harder to keep clean. The sick needed water, but water could not be wasted. There were no medicines, no syrups, no pills, only herbs, dried roots, bitter teas, poultices, steam if someone could boil water. And so people waited. The sick waited. The family waited. Some got better. And still, the day continued. The fire had to be kept. The animals had to be fed. The body had to be moved. Injuries were common. Axes slipped. Knives cut. Feet slipped on ice. Pain was endured. Complaints were few. Sometimes the wound killed quickly. Children got sick. Often icily they coughed. They wheezed. They burned with fever. The old were more vulnerable. Bones colder, skin thinner. Immune to nothing. Every winter was harder. Every illness lasted longer. There was no burial in frozen ground. The earth was too hard. The snow too deep. Bodies were wrapped. Left in sheds. Funerals were short. Quiet. The ground was still frozen. There were no flowers. Illness in winter was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was not loud. It was slow. It was quiet. And the rest of the house kept going. Because it had to. Because there was no other choice. Because in the Middle Ages healing was rare. Medicine was scarce. Warmth was luxury. Rest was impossible. In the Middle Ages, no one survived winter alone. Not entirely. Not fully. Not for long. A family might have its own fire, its own walls, its own food. Who had lost someone last winter? Who was strong? Who was weak? Who could be counted on? Who could not? There were disputes. There were feuds. There were grudges. But winter softened them sometimes. Through passing traders. Through the church. The priest knew who was ailing, who was hungry, who was fading. Sometimes he spoke large, or sometimes used to shelter the sick, the old. The coldest nights brought people there, quietly. One of them for many families. Bread was baked on rotation. People waited their turn. No one skipped. No one took more than their share. If they did, others remembered. And winter was long, and grudges held weight slowly, just to be near the fire, just to be near others. Sometimes he didn't. But he saw a feud meant nothing when the door would not open, when the roof had caved in, when the baby would not stop crying. But they were known. You did not take what was not yours. You did not ask twice in a day. You did not speak loudly at night. You helped lift the neighbor's cart. You shared the first sprouts of spring. You didn't laugh when someone's roof leaked. You offered silence instead. In summer, in harvest, in habit. Winter only revealed it, tested it, stressed it. Who gave them crusts of bread? Who sent them away? They learned early, because childhood was short. Sometimes silence stayed silence, and someone was lost. And the next year, the village remembered, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with nothing. To routine, and routine was built by people, living beside each other. A man with a mule. They were watched, cautiously, suspiciously, but not always turned away. A bowl was given, a place near the hearth, because someday, someone from the village might be in that position. About those who didn't make it, and those who did. Stories taught without teaching. Warnings wrapped in memory. Instructions wrapped in fear. A bucket of apples left at a door. No thanks given. None expected. That was the way. That was the rhythm. And memory lasted. You did not forget what someone had done, but you still lent them your axe. But without others, it could not survive everything. Because winter was not only cold, it was long. It was unpredictable. It was unforgiving. Weakness in their bones. Shortness in their stores. And you never knew when yours would show. And if your neighbor had it, they gave it. Or traded it. Or delayed the answer. And sometimes the answer was no. On same days, when the cold paused, when a pig was slaughtered. These moments mattered. They reminded people they were not alone. They reminded people they were still alive. But more often it was later, because no one could afford to give too much too early. And sometimes, it asked for more than one household could provide. When the wind grew sharper, when the snow came heavier, when the food ran out faster than expected, when the firewood spoiled in the damp, when illness arrived without warning, then people turned to each other. Quietly, hesitantly, carefully. There were no grand gestures, no great rescues. Just quiet patterns, quiet agreements, quiet habits built over years. A shared loaf, a borrowed pot, a few sticks of kindling, a helping hand with a frozen door, an extra bowl when a child was sick, a candle when someone had none. It was not kindness in the way we think of it. It was not charity, it was not generosity, it was survival. Because the next time, the need might be reversed. Today you give, tomorrow you ask. That was the rule. That was how the village held together. Villages were small. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew who had chickens, who had goats, who had extra blankets. There was no emergency service, no distant help, no central aid. If you needed something, you asked your neighbor. Visits were rare in deep winter. The paths were buried. The air was too sharp. But messages were sent through children. The church was the center of word, of ritual, of news. It was warmer than most homes. Communal baking was common. Children ran messages. They carried wood. They fetched water. They learned the routes, the faces, who could be trusted. Sometimes strangers came, a traveler, a beggar. Rules were not written, because everyone had problems. Everyone had cracks in their walls. There were gatherings, rare ones. Feasts at Christmas. Stories were shared, around fires, in corners, quietly, about past winters, about harder times. There were quiet acts. A child's shoes repaired by an unseen hand. A goat fed in secret. Community was not perfect, but it was necessary, and it was not built in winter. It was built in spring, and sometimes it failed. Sometimes help did not come. Sometimes neighbors stayed inside. But most of the time, communities held, not because of goodness, but because of need. Not because people liked each other, but because they needed each other. In the Middle Ages, winter did not care about love, but it responded to structure, to repetition, not always kindly, but reliably. That was what mattered. That was how they survived. In the Middle Ages, winter was not explained, it was endured. And in the long months of dark and cold and silence, people turned to what they could not see, to what they could not measure, to what they could not understand. They turned to faith, because the weather offered no answers. The sicknesses offered no mercy. The harvest offered no guarantees. But the church offered structure. The calendar offered meaning. The rituals offered rhythm. And when everything else changed, that rhythm stayed. The bell rang on Sunday. The priest said mass. The candles were lit. The prayers were spoken. The saints were remembered. The calendar of the church became the calendar of winter. Advent came as the nights lengthened. A time of quiet, a time of waiting, then Christmas. Not with presents, but with fasting, with prayer, with a shared meal, with a warm room. If warmth could be spared, then Epiphany, then Lent, then the long walk toward Easter. And along the way, small days marked time. Saint days, holy days, not celebrations, but reminders. That time still moved, that the world had not stopped. The peasants knew the words, even if they didn't understand the Latin, even if they didn't understand the theology. They knew when to kneel, when to stand, when to fast, when to sing. The church gave them certainty. The church gave them ritual. In a world where nothing was certain, ritual mattered. You lit the same candle. You said the same prayer. You followed the same order. Not because it always worked, but because not doing it felt worse. The priest was not just a spiritual leader. He was a guide, a witness, a keeper of knowledge. He knew who had died, who had survived, who had sinned, who had confessed. He was not always trusted, but he was always present. There were other beliefs too. Older ones, quieter ones. Beliefs in signs, in omens, in spirits, in the movements of birds, in the shape of frost on the door, in the dreams that came just before sunrise. These were not spoken in the church, but they were spoken at home. People believed in blessings, in curses, in the power of relics, of bones, of water touched by a saint. They hung charms. They whispered prayers over the sick. They salted thresholds. They marked doors with chalk, just in case. Because winter was not just cold. It was strange. It was long. It changed people. It took people, and if it could not be understood, maybe it could be survived through faith, through ritual, through obedience. The days blurred together, but the rituals broke them apart. Sunday was different. So was St. Stephen's Day. So was the Feast of St. Blaise. These were not days off. They were days with purpose, days with ritual, days with hope. And when someone died, the rituals helped again. The body was washed, wrapped, blessed, prayed over, buried when the ground allowed, marked with a cross. Named in Mass, it did not take the pain away, but it gave the pain shape. And when grief had shape, it could be carried. Hope was not loud, it did not shout, it whispered. It lingered in the stories of saints who suffered. It flickered in the candle flame. It echoed in the chanting of psalms. It lived in the promise of resurrection, of spring, of return. Spring was more than a season, it was a theology. It was the idea that death was not the end, that buried things could rise, that frozen things could thaw, that hunger would be answered, that silence would break, that light would come again. They looked for signs. The first shoots in the garden, the first bird in the sky, the way the air smelled after snow, the way the earth softened beneath their boots. And when they saw those signs, they didn't celebrate loudly. They simply noticed and whispered it to one another. The waiting was almost over, but not yet. So they returned to prayer, to ritual, to structure, to order, because it gave them something the weather could not. It gave them a sense that this, too, had meaning, that the cold was not wasted, that the suffering was not random, that the waiting would end. Faith did not explain everything, but it allowed them to keep going, and that, in the end, was enough. In the Middle Ages, clothing was not fashion. It was survival. Fabric was not a choice, it was a wall. A thin defense against wind, against snow, against cold that slipped through cracks and into bones. You did not dress to look good. You dressed to endure, And in winter, that meant layers, layer after layer after layer. Whatever you had, whatever was dry, whatever was not already worn by someone else. Clothes were not many. A peasant might own 2 tunics, maybe 1, a cloak, if lucky, shoes, if fortunate, gloves, rarely a hat, sometimes. But winter did not wait for more clothes, so you wore what you had again and again, until it tore, until it thinned, until it froze. Clothes were patched, repaired, restitched by hand, by candlelight, by memory. Old fabric became new sleeves became old rags, rags became foot wraps. Nothing was wasted. Wool was best. Wool stayed warm even when wet, too thin, too worn. But children grew, clothes did not. And so every winter, someone wore something that didn't quite fit, that didn't quite work. Wool could be spun at home, but it took time, it took sheep, it took skill. But wet clothes often stayed wet, and wet clothes in winter were dangerous. Not everyone had all three. Undergarments were made of linen. If linen could be afforded, if linen could be washed, linen was cold when it was damp. But even they felt the cold. Even they needed fire. Even they wore layers, but better than nothing. Outer layers were thicker. Tunics, cloaks, wrapped tight, bound with belts. You layered in the morning. You did not change during the day. Not to tear their only cloak on a branch. Not to fall into snow that soaked through boots, trapped in fabric, held between layers, maintained by stillness. Thicker, heavier, scratched together, or movement, or luck. You added when you could. Removed only if sweating. And sweat was dangerous because sweat froze. Or wealth, or both. But even small bits mattered. A lining in a collar, a trim at the edge of a sleeve. When they could be tied with string, stuffed with straw, with moss, with wool, to keep the cold out, to slow the frostbite. But some were warmer than others, layered with whatever else could be found. A sack, a scrap, a piece of fur, then ears, then noses. There were no thick boots, no rubber soles, no insulation, just layers. Fur was rare. Fur meant hunting. Shoes were leather. Feet froze first, then fingers. Mittens were rare. Fingers had to work. Gloves were expensive, so hands were wrapped in cloths, in strips, in hope. At night, the clothes stayed on. You did not undress to sleep. You climbed under a blanket. If you had one, shared body heat. If someone was beside you, huddled close, in corners, in piles, to make warmth where none existed. Children wore what adults had outgrown. Clothes too large. Clothes were dried by the fire if they were wet. If there was time, if there was firewood, you dressed before the fire, you dressed fast, you dressed in silence. Because the warmth would not last. There was no wardrobe, no closet, just pegs, hooks, baskets, places where fabric waited, where damp wool steamed. The rich dressed better. They had furs, cloaks, linings, boots. There were no buttons, no zippers. Clothes were tied, laced, pinned, and fingers that were cold could not tie easily. So you prepared people learned to move carefully, not to overheat, not to get wet, because dry was survival. Warmth came from the body. There were no coats in the modern sense, just more of the same. The poor made do. The very poor wore sacks, wore rope, wore hope, and still the wind blew, still the snow fell, still the frost gathered, and still people stepped outside, because they had to. Because the animals needed feeding, the wood needed splitting, the food needed fetching, the life needed living. And so the battle against cold continued, every day, every night, one layer at a time. In the Middle Ages, no one was truly warm. And that was often the difference between making it to spring or not. In the Middle Ages, children were not the center of the household, but they were always there, always near the hearth, always watching, always listening, always waiting for warmth, for food, for work, for instruction. And in the winter, they waited longer. They listened more, because winter slowed everything, including childhood. A child in winter was a quiet thing, not because they didn't have thoughts or dreams or feelings, but because there was less room for them, less room to run, less room to shout, less room to cry. The house was smaller in winter, even if the walls stayed the same. The light was dimmer, the air was heavier, the floor was colder, and the space was full of bodies, full of smoke, full of work. And the work did not stop for children. If they were old enough to walk, they were old enough to fetch, old enough to stir, old enough to hold, to sweep, to carry, to feed the chickens, to gather eggs, to cut kindling, to boil water, to stir soup. And they did, slowly, clumsily, repeatedly, not perfectly, but with effort, because there was no time to be idle. Not in winter, but still, children found ways to play, not because it was encouraged, not because it was allowed, but because it was needed, because the human heart, even when small, even when cold, even when hungry, still looks for joy. And they found it in scraps of wood, in bones, in sticks, in pebbles warmed by the fire, in shadows on the wall, in the shapes that frost made on windows, in the way the wind howled around corners, in songs sung by older siblings, in riddles told by tired parents, in the rhythm of the spinning wheel, in the sound of boots stomping snow off of the door. Play was not scheduled, it was not planned, it was stolen. From time, from chores, from fatigue. A laugh in the corner, a whispered game beneath a bench, a pretend kingdom made of straw, a race to the frozen stream and back, breathless and bright-eyed, and then back to work. Back to silence, back to cold fingers and stiff wool and cracked lips. Toys were few, a carved figure, a doll stuffed with rags, a ball made of leather, a game of knucklebone sometimes borrowed, sometimes made, sometimes remembered, and always shared, because nothing was owned entirely. Older children watched younger ones, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Mothers were busy, fathers were away, work needed doing. So the older became teachers, and protectors, and comforters. They told the younger ones what not to touch, what not to say, where not to step, how to act when guests entered, how to behave when someone was sick, how to be small when the house needed silence. Children learned by watching, by doing, by failing, by being scolded, gently or harshly, and sometimes not at all, because winter was not the season for softness. Schooling was rare, books were rarer, but learning happened anyway, through song, through repetition, through watching bread rise, watching snow melt, watching a fire catch, watching a goat birth a kid. There was no playroom, no separate space. Children slept beside their parents, beside their siblings, on pallets of straw, under thin blankets, listening to the wind, listening to breathing, listening to coughing, and learning what silence meant. Sometimes a child did not wake up, and the family grieved quietly, because others still needed feeding, still needed dressing, still needed holding. The loss was folded into the day, into the next bowl of soup, into the next log on the fire. And the other children kept living, and the house kept going. Stories were told, not always happily, not always kindly. Some were warnings of wolves in the woods, of spirits in the dark, of neighbors who had not been careful. They were stories meant to teach, meant to shape, meant to hold attention while fingers worked and eyes drooped and the candle burned low. Sometimes a neighbor would visit, and their children would come too. And for an hour, the house would be louder, brighter, warmer, until the visit ended, and they walked home through snow. There were no holidays as we know them, no toys wrapped in paper, no colored lights, but there was Christmas, and Christmas meant something. It meant a different meal, a longer prayer, a rare sweetness, a new candle, a moment to remember that spring would come. Children waited for it, not for presents, but for a change in rhythm, a moment of stillness, a chance to taste something other than porridge. Winter made childhood slower, quieter, heavier, but not empty, because even in darkness, children imagined, and imagination was its own kind of warmth. In the Middle Ages, winter did not just change how things felt, it changed how things sounded, how they moved, how they echoed, how they faded, and in those long cold months, the world outside the cottage turned quiet. Not silent, but quiet, thick with a stillness that made every sound louder, sharper, slower. Footsteps on snow didn't whisper, they crunched. Hooves didn't thud, they cracked. A shout across the field didn't scatter into the air it carried, it lingered. It reached places it shouldn't have, and so people learned to speak differently in winter. Lower, closer, with fewer words. Sound became sharper because the world was duller. And in that dullness, people listened more, because winter remembered what was said. Winter held sound the way frost held branches, tightly. They felt the silence around them and stepped more lightly inside it, heavy again, as if it had never left. About wolves that waited at the edge of the path, the stories were not shouted. They were whispered, because in winter, you did not wake what slept. An animal, a branch, the sound of snow sliding from the roof. But still, people checked, just in case. The goats turned toward the door. The cows shifted in the dark, their sound longer, lower, more solemn. No leaves to muffle them, no birds to answer them, just bells, and sky, and snow. It seemed to ask questions no one wanted to answer, and if they came closer, someone would rise, slowly, cautiously, because no one visited without reason. The trees stopped moving, their leaves were gone. Their limbs were stiff, the wind blew through them like a whistle through bone. The birds were fewer, the animals quieter. Everything that once chattered now crept. Mice, foxes, wolves, a trickle of water beneath the ice, a bird's cry in the gray sky, the creak of thawing wood, that thick, pressing quiet that wrapped the village like another layer of snow. The sound of animals in winter was different. It came from under snow, from inside walls, from far away, and it was always followed by stillness. People moved less, so the roads made fewer noises. No wagons rattled, no carts clattered. If someone passed by, you heard them coming long before you saw them, just distant, like the sun. The jingle of a harness, the creak of frozen leather, the cough of a man walking alone. And then, nothing. Inside, the house made its own winter sounds. The snap of firewood, the hiss of wet logs, the groan of timbers contracting in the cold, the drip of melted snow from a roof to thin, the rattle of wind through the breathing of those sleeping, the occasional murmur from a dream. When someone coughed, it echoed. When a spoon scraped a bowl, it rang out. When a door opened, the whole house noticed. Church bells rang over empty fields. Children were quieter in winter, not hushed, just slowed. Their play was softer, their voices careful. Sometimes the silence broke. A branch fell from a tree, a scream came from the forest, a roof collapsed under snow, and then silence returned. People told stories in the quiet, around the fire, stories about ghosts, about saints. Hearing footsteps outside made the whole room go still. Everyone listened, waited, wondered if the steps would stop or come closer. Sometimes it was nothing, because winter taught you not to ignore small sounds. Even the animals listened. The dog raised its head. The hens stopped scratching. Wind was louder in winter. It howled. It shrieked. It slammed against shutters. It slipped through cracks. It seemed to speak, and in between the gusts, there was always that stillness again. You could walk through the fields in winter and hear nothing but your own breath, your own steps, your own thoughts. And that kind of silence changed people. It made them slower, more careful, more inward, not sad. And as the days slowly grew longer, the sounds began to return. And people noticed, not with words, but with stillness, because winter had taught them how to hear again. In the Middle Ages, winter did not end in a moment. It faded, it loosened, it softened its grip slowly, and as it did, it left behind not relief, not celebration, but hunger, because the thaw did not bring food, it brought mud and ice that cracked, but did not disappear, and roads that melted, but did not become passable, and snow that turned to slush, and water that turned to rut. And as the air warmed, the stores emptied, and the people waited. They waited with thinner faces, with weaker hands, with slower steps, because by the end of winter, they were not just cold, they were tired. The bread was stale. The grain was nearly gone. The root cellar was empty. The salted meat was sour. The cheese was cracked and blue. The last of the apples were brown and soft. Nothing was fresh. Nothing was new. Nothing was easy. And yet life began to return. Not quickly, not loudly, but slowly, quietly, in signs that the world had not ended, in puddles that formed where ice had ruled, in soil that no longer crunched underfoot, in chickens that began to lay again, in trees that did not yet bloom but no longer stood stiff with frost, in sun that lingered just a little longer each day. The peasants did not smile, not yet, because the hardest days were not behind them, they were in front of them, because early spring was the time of true hunger, when nothing was left and nothing had yet grown. The fields were too wet to plant, the woods to bear, to forage, the animals to lean to slaughter, the rivers too cold to fish. It was a time of waiting, of chewing hard crusts and licking empty bowls and boiling water with herbs just to feel full. The children cried more in early spring than in midwinter. The old coughed longer. The sick clung to sleep. The mothers rocked babies with arms that shook, because it was not the cold that broke people, it was the emptiness that followed. And still, they worked, because the soil had to be turned, the fences repaired, the carts lifted from the mud, the tools cleaned of rust, the seeds sorted, the plans made. No one rested when the snow melted, because spring did not bring rest. It brought pressure. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden: a broken roof, a frozen pipe, a body no one had buried, a crack in the wall, a gap in the stores. And everything had to be answered, fixed, repaired, rebuilt, with hands that trembled, with backs that ached, with hope that flickered, hope, because the birds returned, because the sky shifted, because the light grew, because the priest said it was nearly Easter, and Easter meant green, and green meant food. Eventually, they watched the ground like it might speak, watched the trees like they might move, touched the soil to feel its temperature, looked to the sky and hoped the frost would not return, because it could. It often did. One last freeze, one last storm, one last reminder that winter had not truly gone. But even then, the thaw pushed on. The rivers swelled, the roads cleared, the sun warmed the faces that dared look up, and people emerged from cottages, from barns, from silence. They spoke again, not much, but more. They asked who had survived, who had lost someone, who needed help, who had seed, who had flour. The hunger was not gone, but it was shared. That made it easier, not lighter, but clearer. And the first shoots came, green in the brown, fragile, shivery, precious a weed, a sprout, a blade. Not food yet, but promise. And that was enough for now. The return of life was not sudden, it was not joyful, it was not bright, it was cautious, careful, earned, because those who had made it through winter knew what it had taken, and they would not forget. Not quickly, not easily. They would remember the darkness, the silence, the cold, the hunger, the loss, the waiting, but they would also remember the fire, the closeness, the stories, the shared bread, the prayers. Because in the end, survival was not one act. It was many, small, repetitive, often unseen. And spring was not a gift. It was a result, the reward for not giving up, for mending the cloak one more time, for boiling the same broth again, for walking to the neighbor's door, for lighting the candle when it cost too much, for singing the lullaby when no one felt like singing, for whispering the name of a child who had made it another day. That was how they survived. And now, slowly, the world returned. Not because it was kind, but because it was time. And so the winter passed, not quickly, not gently, but completely. It left behind footprints. It left behind scars. It left behind silence, but it also left behind people. People who had endured. People who had bent but not broken. People who had eaten less, spoken less, wept more, and still woken up each day. Because in the Middle Ages, surviving winter was not a triumph. It was an expectation. It was not a victory. It was a necessity. And humans, even in the coldest centuries, find ways to keep going. And it was not remembered with songs or stories or celebrations. It was remembered in habits, in the way they layered their clothes, in the way they rationed their food, in the way they looked at the sky. We often imagine them as helpless, as pitiful, as fragile, but they were not. They were simply human. Through fire, through ritual, through each other, through work, through repetition, through a stubborn refusal to stop. Not always in snow, not always in frost, but in other forms. Not because they knew spring was coming, but because they knew they had no other choice. And maybe, in that quiet persistence, there's something to remember, something to honor, something to carry. Because even now, in our warm homes, with our full cupboards and glowing screens, the winter still comes. And still, we endure, as they did, quietly, patiently together.